We're talking today about contemporary Muslim identities and what that means and what that looks like. And I have some notes that I want to share with you, just based on my experience and my perspective, but I really want this to be a dialogue. I don't want to just be standing here lecturing at you. I want you to feel like you're taking away something and the issues and the topics that are relevant to you are also being addressed. So for the first piece of my talk, I'm going to be sharing some thoughts and ideas and experiences and lessons that I've learned, along with some statistics and figures that might give you a better snapshot of what it means to reconcile your identity as American Muslims. And then I also want to hear from you. I want to hear your questions and your thoughts and your ideas as well, inshallah. So when we talk about contemporary Muslim identities, right? When I ask myself this question as a Muslim American, images flash through my mind of the Supreme Court rally that took place against the Muslim ban earlier this week. How many of you know someone who's been directly impacted by the Muslim ban? Meaning that they have either not been able to travel overseas or they have not been able to bring family members here to the United States, or quite a few of you. So there was maybe a couple hundred people who gathered outside of the Supreme Court, Muslims and allies, to protest against the Muslim ban, which is currently in effect, by the way, as Supreme Court justices heard oral arguments in the case. And it struck me that in the 21st century, we're living in an America where Muslims increasingly have to prove their Americanness or their patriotism or their identity as being worthy of being able to call themselves American. And there's no justice in that. And some of those who attended from the impacted countries, just having conversations with them, you really get to see firsthand the impact that this executive order is having on our communities. I remember when the first iteration of the Muslim ban was passed or was signed into law last year, we heard in Maryland from a Yemeni individual who was a legal permanent resident. And his mother had just passed away in Iran. And he was advised by his attorney to not travel to Iran for her janazah because they couldn't guarantee that he would be able to re-enter into the United States. And mind you, this is a legal permanent resident, right? And so these are very real stories of people who are being impacted by this policy. And when you hear these stories, it's hard not to feel angry. It's hard not to feel upset. Because you feel like, as Americans, as law-abiding citizens, as people who pay taxes, right, who contribute to society in so many different ways, as one mother put it to me after the 2016 presidential election, you still constantly feel like a second-class citizen. You feel like you pay first-class taxes, but you still feel like a second-class citizen. The reality is that when people think of Muslims in America, they automatically think of immigrants or foreigners. They think of somebody who is new to America. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Islam is far from new to our country, right? If we look at the history of our country, we know that thousands of African Americans were brought against their will during the transatlantic slave trade to the United States at that time, which was not the United States. And our faith has a long, rich tradition that is intricately woven into America's social fabric. When we talk with especially interfaith allies and partners, and we have discussions about the legacy of Islam in America, oftentimes people are shocked to learn that Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran. If you go to the Library of Congress, how many of you have been to the Library of Congress? Library of Congress, no hands. Well, it's on the other coast, so you guys have to come visit, inshallah. But if you go to the Library of Congress, there's actually a copy of the Holy Quran that was owned by Thomas Jefferson that's on display. And when we tell people that, they're just flabbergasted, because for many of them, their perception and their imagery and their ideas of Islam didn't really begin to form until after 9/11. And unfortunately, we know that the perceptions that were formed after 9/11 have been largely negative, have been largely toxic. For years, we know that the perception of Muslims has been driven largely by the media, by Hollywood, by pop culture. We've all seen those stereotypical images of the angry Muslims or the Arabs who are up to no good or who are trying to wage terror. And I believe the CARE chapter in LA does a lot of work around dismantling some of those stereotypes and misconceptions and working with producers and other figures in Hollywood to present a more balanced perception of Islam in the media. But more recently, however, we see a new trend emerging in our communities that's creating a different vibe for Muslims in America. We see more Muslims building our own spaces. They're creating our own platforms. They are reclaiming our own narratives in ways that we have never seen before. And this is especially important as research reveals that despite all of the advances in modern technology and methods of communication, our communities being more integrated than ever before, over half of Americans in the United States still say that they've never met a Muslim before. There's actually a research poll, a poll that was put out by Pew Forum that suggested that over 50% of Americans in 2018 still say that they've never met a Muslim that they know of. And this is for someone like me who grew up in a very kind of a diverse community. It's shocking to me that, that figure is so large. It shows that we still have so much work to do in terms of reaching out to communities, especially in the heartland of America, who don't know much about Islam and Muslims except what they see in the media. So whereas before Muslims were commonly known to be entrepreneurs, physicians, lawyers, engineers, we now have a more broadly diversified portfolio in our communities. We see more and more Muslims who are becoming journalists, athletes, bloggers, activists, who are defying the stereotypical norms of following a career path in pre-medicine or pre-law or engineering, and who are daring to do something that speaks to them personally. And so we see artists who are creating these dynamic spaces where their imaginations are really free to roam. They have more leeway in terms of expressing their identities. And this is really special because this breaks past the restrictive confines that are imposed by culture, right? So for so many of us, we grew up in a household where our parents kind of guided us into a certain career path. And the idea of, I don't know about you, but I'm actually a pharmacist who segued into activism because I was one of those Muslims. But the idea of defying the pressure from parents can be overwhelming. Alhamdulillah, now we're seeing more and more youth, especially youth, who are doing, who are forging their own path, who are creating their narrative, who are unapologetically saying that I'm not going to accept this version of Islam or Muslims that's being spoon-fed to me by the society that I live in. I'm going to create my own path. And alhamdulillah, it's been incredibly inspirational to see some of those stories come into play firsthand. And this is especially important because we know that no story about creating an American Muslim identity can be complete without talking about the challenges that our communities face, right? When we talk about Islam in America, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear about a mass shooting or any kind of a horrific attack or incident? What's the first thing that you think of? Don't let it be Muslim, right? The first thing when we see those headlines of some incident happening somewhere, so many Muslims across the country find themselves praying, dear God, don't let it be Muslim. And it's absolutely unacceptable that any Muslim would ever feel like we have to apologize or that we have to defend our faith, our values, just because somebody who does horrible things happens to share our religion. And mind you, no other faith has to deal with the same kind of challenges that we do in that sense. According to CARE's 2018 Civil Rights Report, hate crimes against our communities and bias incidents have skyrocketed again between 2016 and 2017. So CARE and many other organizations also follow the pattern of discrimination and bias towards Muslims. And we've seen annually there's a growth in the number of incidents that take place across the United States. I mean, there's the usual, Arizona, Texas, Florida. This is the hotbed of anti-Muslim activity. But we actually are seeing something transformative, something actually alarming. And that's that even in some of the most diverse, most integrated parts of America, we're starting to see more incidents of bigotry, of fear-mongering. There's this emboldening of Islamophobia in ways that we've never seen it before, pre-9/11 or even post-9/11. We know that the challenges that our communities are facing are not unique to our communities. We know that before us, there were Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Irish Americans. Our Black brothers and sisters are still facing and still enduring the same pattern of discrimination and racism and bigotry, anti-Black racism, since even before its founding. And so this is not something that's new or exclusive to Muslims in America. A lot of people say that we're having to deal with it. We're the most recent targets. And I think it's also important to understand that for our Black brothers and sisters within the Muslim community, they are at the intersection of having to reconcile their identities because they not only deal with Islamophobia, they also deal with anti-Black racism, and oftentimes that's packaged together. And so, especially for non-Black people of color and for other Muslims, the responsibility, the onus is upon us to make sure that we are doing our due diligence to center the right voices and to push back against not only Islamophobia but also anti-Black racism. For a lot of us, being Muslim means being guilty until you're proven innocent. And there was actually a study that was published by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding that people who were perceived to be Muslim or who are Muslim were far more likely to experience negative media coverage, and they were actually more likely to receive a harsher punishment for similar crimes. And it reveals that prosecutors actually sought 3 times longer sentences for those who identified as Muslim. This despite the similarity in scope and nature of the crimes that were committed. And even despite this, even despite all of this dismal kind of statistics that we see and the data that we have, Pew Research still shows that Muslims are amongst the most proudest Americans. We are amongst the most, the communities that are the most civically and politically engaged, who are doing our part in creating a healthy, holistic society. The reality is the mosaic of emerging American Muslims in America is the most ethnically and racially diverse in the country. And this is at a period in time when all religions are struggling to retain their youth. I was actually talking with a Catholic friend of mine in Washington, D.C. a couple weeks ago, and she was talking to me about an epidemic within the Catholic Church where they have lost so many of their youth. They have mass or they have services, and it's all adults, older adults, or the elderly, and they are seeing this trend where more and more the younger generation is not coming to church. And it struck me because across religious lines we're seeing this kind of trend. We see this in mosques as well. How many of you have seen the documentary Unmosqued? Unmosqued, a few of you. So this documentary actually really highlights the crisis within the Muslim communities as well, where many Muslims don't feel comfortable in their masajid. They feel like there isn't a space for them. They feel that the mosque leaders don't they don't speak to them. They don't speak to their identity as Muslims. They don't understand their challenges. They can't relate to them. And so more and more youth are drifting away from masajid. And we know that, this is a serious conversation that mosque leaders across the country have started engaging in with parents, with educators, on ways that we can bring the younger generation back into the masajid, and how we can make the mosque not only a space where people come to pray, but also a space where people can get involved in the community, and especially youth can get involved in the community and feel confident in their identity as American Muslims who attend masajid, who are part of the committees, different committees, youth groups, who are on the board, who are who feel like they have a space in that mosque. Contrary to popular opinion, in some parts of the country, Islam is not a monolith. I know many of you can relate to this when I say that people look at me and they have a very Orientalist kind of perspective, that, oh, you remind me of Jasmine, or I know another girl, she looks just like you, and you guys are very similar, and I have no idea who she's talking about. But they have this very kind of one-dimensional perspective of Muslims. And the reality is our communities are so diverse. We're not a monolith, and that's actually what makes Muslims in our communities, Islam in America, so precious, so vibrant, because we have so many different dimensions, we have so many different contributions and so many different personalities and talents that we bring to the table. This diversity of thoughts and opinions is actually conducive to and reflective of growth, right? Because who wants to live in a society where everybody's like a cookie-cutter version of themselves, right? Like there wouldn't be anything to talk about. Like it would be so bland. Like you want to have people who are different than you around you, because that's how we learn and grow. If we only expose ourselves to people who look like us, who talk like us, who act like us, then we are only going to know, one aspect of our ummah. And we rob ourselves of that ability to be appreciative of what actually makes Islam so powerful and so great. And that's the fact that we are a diverse community. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran that we were created in nations and tribes to get to know one another and to learn to coexist. And you've probably often heard this verse because it's recited at almost every interfaith gathering that you can attend. And I think it's really important to also reflect on this verse in the sense that it's not only applicable between Muslims and non-Muslims, but it's also applicable within our communities, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Muslims into nations and tribes to get to know one another as well. And yet so often when we go to different masajid, we go to different community events, different functions, different dinners, events, luncheons, banquets, what have you, we see like the Arabs are with the Arabs, the Desis are with the Desis, the Somalis are with the Somalis, like the Sudanese are with the Sudanese, and each community kind of like isolates itself off into silos. And this is not an example of Islam. This is not the Islam of our Prophet ﷺ. It's so important for us to be open to the idea of engaging in conversation with people who look different from us. And oftentimes this requires stepping outside of our comfort zone, being willing to be present in uncomfortable spaces, right? It means sometimes learning a new language, or learning how to cook different foods, or learning different sports that we might never have been exposed to before. But the reality is that we will find when we do that, that we actually enrich ourselves. We broaden our horizons and we learn so much more about the world than we knew before. And brothers and sisters, I'm going to be very frank with you. When bigots target our communities, right? When haters are blasting Muslims, they're attacking mosques, right? When they're pulling hijabs off of hijabis' heads, when they're bullying Muslim children in school, they're not sitting there wondering to themselves, oh, is this person a Sunni or a Shia, right? They're not asking themselves, are they Maliki, Hanafi, Sambali, Salafi, or Sufi, right? They're not asking themselves, is this person American-born or are they an immigrant? They're attacking all of us. They're attacking what we represent. So it's in our interest to stand together, to stand up for each other, and to be there for one another, especially in this political climate where Muslims are under attack, where we do feel more vulnerable, especially in certain spaces where Muslims are not very visible. While we put on our fire hats, we're out dousing flames on multiple fronts, we can't afford to neglect our own communities and our own homes and let them burn to the ground. We have a responsibility to stand up for one another, to be there for one another, to understand each other's perspectives, to understand each other's experiences, to give each other space to explain what our stories are, instead of having like our predefined notion of who other people are. So my message in this first part of my talk is very simple. Stand up for one another, love one another, protect one another, be there for one another, and center especially the voices of the impacted communities that are especially vulnerable because they're at the intersection of many different identities that are vulnerable to Islamophobia, anti-black racism, anti-immigrant racism, anti-refugee racism, different levels of bigotry and hatred that manifest in different ways that we might not always be aware of. So pass the microphone, learn from each other's experiences, and don't do it as a favor to anyone else. Like when we do this, when we create these spaces in our communities for one another, we're not doing anybody else a favor, right? We're not doing anybody else a favor. This is for ourselves. We're doing ourselves a favor. Because the Islam of our beloved Prophet ﷺ, it was an inclusive Islam, right? It was an Islam that was non-judgmental. It was an Islam that created space. It was a merciful Islam. It was a welcoming Islam. It is an expansive Islam that allows us to expand our hearts and bring in people and create spaces where everybody feels welcome and nobody feels marginalized or isolated. And this is a kind of Islam that, inshallah, will help protect and preserve our ummah for generations to come. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us and uplift us and empower us. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.